I'm Metta Spencer, and today I get to talk to an old friend, Nigel Young. Nigel and I were graduate students together back in the 60s in Berkeley. So we have a lot to cover since then, because both of us have become and have spent most of our lives as peace activists and peace researchers. And yet we haven't really had that much contact all these years. So Nigel is in his home in, is it Skipton, England? Say hello, Nigel.
Hello from the Yorkshire Dales.
Nigel has taught for a number of years at Colgate University and is back in his home country. As you have two new books coming out. One of them is a book about nationalism that you've just written, and it's not yet in print, as I understand it. But you have another book, which is of interest to me, that is an Encyclopedia of Peace. Let's talk a little bit about your encyclopedia. How many volumes is this thing, and how long have you been working on it?
It's a modest 4 volumes, 2 million words, 850 entries, 402 writers from all over the world. You can do a publishing venture, which is an organizing, action as well, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely, yes.
It's not just producing a work that's going to sit on a shelf. It becomes a live process.
You are describing exactly what is the most interesting challenge about editing. I've been doing editing of magazines and all kinds of other things over the years. And in fact, I would say only half of the project involves the actual work on manipulating words and making sure that the syntax is right. The other half is in contacting people and cultivating their goodwill.
Yeah, well, I had lots of that, and wonderful people that I'd never met before and never known before. But this work, I feel, that's one of my kind of my World Wide Web.
Well, I certainly understand exactly what you're saying, because, by the way, what's the name of your encyclopedia?
The OIEP, the Oxford International Encyclopedia of Peace.
Now, a few years ago, Lester Kurtz, of course, did one, a peace encyclopedia, which I was involved with to some extent. In fact, he did two different editions.
It's a snippet, $300 for 4 volumes. Hey, come on.
That's what
Adam Roberts, who gave one of the speeches at the launch, he said, "There's one problem with this encyclopedia. It's too heavy to put on the back of my bicycle."
Good for him. We can always say that in order to be an accredited peace researcher, you have to have read at least one of the volumes completely and pass an exam. All right?
Which part of the alphabet will you choose?
By the way, you aren't teaching anymore, but I hear you said that if you needed to go into town, Bradford would be the place that you would go. Now, Bradford is the main place in England where people still can take degrees in peace studies, right?
It's one of several now. There's one you can do it at Canterbury and in London, and so there are a few others in England now.
Okay.
But Bradford was the first. 1973, and of course I was part of the starting it back in '73, a long time ago. But that was the first peace studies department teaching a peace studies, 3 peace studies degree, PhD, MA, and bachelor's. It was the first one in the UK to do that. About the same time, of course, a number of programs were starting off in the US, including Colgate, almost the same time.
Well, I had a program at my college, for 15 years. I organized a program in peace and conflict studies and ran it until I retired, and then they closed it down. And I didn't mind that they closed it down, because I'd rather have it not run than to be done badly. And I'm afraid that, at least here, people, most academics don't really know what peace studies is. And they would probably hire somebody to teach it who never heard of it. And
just to go back to the encyclopedia, that's one of the reasons for doing it, was to, actually give a very complicated, but, well, complex, but yet also accessible overview of what the peace field entails.
Mm-hmm,
so, for a university department to have that reference work, which I was pleased to see in my old college, it's now on the shelves, is very important, because that means you people, just looking at the content, they think, well, that's what peace studies do.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
what researchers research.
Yes, yes.
So, I think it's very important in establishing that. We can't assume that people will know what peace studies is.
Well, they not only can't assume, but you can pretty well assume they won't know what it is, even maybe especially political scientists.
Right.
Because the only opposition I had in creating such a program was from the political scientists.
Same I had at Colgate.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of territorial imperialism or some.
Yes.
Yeah, but I remember Kenneth Boulding once had an article saying, could peace studies be an independent autonomous discipline? And he said yes, he thought so, because what does it take to be a discipline? Well, it requires that you have a curriculum, at least a basic core curriculum that every professional in that discipline should be somewhat familiar with. And we do have that. There are certain core articles and names and things, pieces of research that you couldn't say you're a real good peace researcher if you didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things. And he also said that to be a special profession, you need to be able to test your own people. So we would have to have an understanding about what it takes to take an exam and pass a qualifying exam to become a PhD in peace research. And I think we could do that too. At least the two of us could if we got together. Don't you think?
Oh, very much so. And of course, I've done that. I've been designing curricula and, I have to say, examinations in the field for a very long time.
That's right.
You must have done in Toronto. So, yeah, it's all part of the work.
What has happened to the program at Colgate since you left? You've been out of there about 10 years, haven't you?
Yes, I stopped teaching in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a little bit of an odd period when we had someone come in who I don't think really knew what peace studies was, but that tends to happen sometimes.
Yeah.
But then a wonderful anthropologist called Nancy Rees, who is an expert on the former Soviet Union, on Russia and things Russian. She came in and took over, and her heart was very much in it, but also her intellectual skills were such that she could, develop a good program. Now it's booming. I mean, it's got, I think sometimes Colgate wishes it didn't have as many students as it does.
Really? Huh?
It's been one of the growth stories in the last 10 years.
Oh, okay.
Of student numbers and so on. And so, credit to her. She's trebled, quadrupled, the number of students doing majors in peace studies at Colgate. So that's good. That's great. Yeah.
Tell me about your new book, the forthcoming book, and what's the title, first of all?
Postnational Memory. And people say, how can you talk about postnational memory when everybody's remembering in a national way? But anyway, postnational memory, making pasts beyond borders. Peace, war, and making pasts beyond borders. In other words, how do we think about the Holocaust, the Shoah, for example, but not think of it as just a German event or a Jewish event? Don't compartmentalize it. It becomes a universal trope, a universal framework of thinking about genocide. So if we think Auschwitz, and I think that, but it is in the end a place where 28 nations get together and sort out issues. And much of that sorting out has been incredibly progressive. Yes, we can look at the rise of the populist nationalists, but it's interesting that except in silly old Britain, those populist nationalists are not saying we've got to get out of Europe. So they still want to do their thing, be Italian or Greek or Polish or Hungarian or whatever it is. but they're content to do that within the framework of the European community.
Okay, now that is something I want to hear you explain. I hadn't actually heard anybody say that before. I assumed that if you have somebody in Poland who's a nationalist, or all these other folks in Hungary and so on, that is just one step towards saying, no, we want out. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that you don't think they're really moving in the direction of wanting out.
Because nationalism, when you scratch it, it's not only about identity, it's also about security, in quotes. And, Poland doesn't go on to go back to being squeezed between Russia and Germany. Poland doesn't, Poland knows that it has a status in Europe that it probably could never have on its own. But more than that, the millions of young Polish people are working in other parts of Europe, which is enriching for them. And in turn, that there's a lot of cultural and other spin-off for people living in Poland itself. So there's a mutual respect that grows there as well. And in the end, I think this populist, although it seems very powerful with Trump and Boris Johnson and the others, and dare I say Putin as well, all playing the nationalist card. I mean, let me talk about just a little bit about memory. Why memory, not history? Because I think we need both. Mm-hmm. But my feeling is that the importance of memory is, first of all, it brings the personal and political together. You and I have our memories, but they are also political ones. They're not just private. Of course they are, but they have public implications, which is obviously, for things like the women's movement, it's been very important to have those two sides of things. The other point is that I think that history has been so much, although it derives so much from human memory, it's very often been the creature of certain governments and the way they frame problems, and particularly national states, security elites, etc. So I think one of the virtues of talking about memory and using literature and film and music and theatre and you name it, all the cultural dimensions of life, is that they widen the frame, not least to include that identification with others across boundaries. And I don't just mean national boundaries. I mean the boundaries of race, of color, of gender, of religious affiliation, or whatever. So that I think that boundary crossing in memory work is much easier than writing history, traditional history. And my first degree was in history, and I benefited from it. But I always wondered what was wrong. Why did I want to go and do sociology instead? And part of it was that there was this constraint, and I think it's still there. And often it's a very negative one. I think it refers us back to certain mythologies of nation states. For example, in England, all this nonsense about England standing alone in 1940 and Churchill and Dunkirk. It's all garbage. It's mythology. And, if you talk to the people who were really there, they'll say it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. So, it's a way of official.
What was it like? I mean, I don't, because I guess I am sharing in that mythology. I assumed there was something behind it. Tell me how I'm mistaken.
Well, read my book. I mean, for example, I as a kid, I played with Italian prisoners of war. Right?
Okay.
I got together with prisoners of war from German camps. I heard the stories of European refugees. Some of them, from places that the Allies had bombed. So that that you begin to see the underside of war, the suffering, the displacement, the terror. My home was completely destroyed by a German bomb, but I don't blame the Germans, because my uncle, who was a bomber pilot, was doing the same to Dresden and Hamburg and all those German cities that we never think about, and just aren't the part of the story. So I think memory helps us redress the balance. It humanizes, it civilianizes, it democratizes the story of the past. And it also enables us to break out of these silly stereotypes. The sort of Basil Fawlty, hatred of the Germans sort of thing,
So let me see if I'm hearing you. That you're saying that our personal memories of our individual experiences, such as you're playing with the children of Italian prisoners of war. I don't know how you did that, but okay. That memory will undermine the solidity of this myth that you're saying historians will have created, and you want to see that nationalistic. There's this term, imagined communities. I think all communities are imagined.
But there are other imagined communities, not just the nation.
Right. Oh, yes, of course. All communities are, in a sense, imagined, aren't they? But now, so you want us to concentrate on undermining the
enemy image, stereotype.
The stereotypes that go with identity in the sense that it's being used nowadays. National identity, nationalism, okay.
Right. As opposed to human.
Yeah. And that by these cultural forms, novels and other cultural detritus can be used to...
well, they do it better than any political tract. They do it better than any history, however enlightened it is. Those bring us a sense of our recognition of the other, of common humanity. And I think that's what great literature, great art, and great poetry and great film does. And I tried in my book to use that alongside, my historical knowledge and other kinds of research to blend together, the creative arts, my personal sense of the past, together with an analytic frame which is different from the traditional state-centric, national-framed way of looking at issues. And I think it's terribly important in the peace field, because right now, I mean, for example, there's a thing in Britain called rethinking security, but they're not rethinking security. They're thinking of alternatives to present British foreign policy. Well, that's not the place to start. You have to start to think about global policy or European policy, think about issues of nuclear weapons, which are not just British, for goodness sake, and to begin to think about these peace and security issues in a much more expanded way. And I think, you were talking about political science, and I think one of the problems with political science is that it has become entrenched in this kind of, we are realists. We know what the real world is like. You don't, we don't talk to me about, Ernest Hemingway or Virginia Woolf or Stanley Kubrick or whatever. That's not, we have to solve the problem in the Straits of Hormuz now. And I said, well, maybe it's a bit late. Maybe that you're not going to be able to solve it. But good luck if you can, and anything we can do will help. But you have to look at the whole Iranian thing in a much larger picture, and in the history of the Middle East, of the relationship of the West with the Islamic world, and so on and so on and so on. So and memory helps break through some of that. And we've compartmentalized the cultural and the political too long. And I think actually when we were at Berkeley, that was dissolving that divide a bit. And I think it helped enormously. Of course, we ran into other problems along the way. But I think one of the reasons that the movements of the 60s were powerful is because they didn't lock themselves into, pre-existing frameworks of understanding.
I'm sorry, who didn't lock?
The movements of the 1960s that you and I were part of, and that they didn't totally escape from that. They didn't totally escape from nationalisms of one sort or another. Sometimes they go overboard in anti-Americanism to identify with somebody else's nation. We all know that, and that can happen on the left over the years, But nevertheless, I think there was potential there, and I think that I owe a lot to being there at that time. To seeing peace in a much more rewarding and I think much more enlightening way. And
I think we probably both share an orientation which is, away from nationalism, away from any kind of particularistic identities, toward looking for more universal categories of being and of working together, of cooperation and so on. But I think I hate to say that we're maybe in a minority. You say, well, this is just a temporary counter reaction against globalization, or you didn't use the word, but let's go ahead and use it if you don't mind. That it is just a backlash or some kind of temporary thing, won't last. I hope you're right. Oh my goodness, I hope you're right. But I'm really fearful. I mean, Trump may win again. Brexit will very likely go forward. I don't know. I shouldn't say very likely. You're the authority and I'm not. But I don't see that much regression in this tendency toward nationalistic, wall building at the border kind of mentality. And I don't fully understand it. In fact, I hardly understand it at all. I simply do not know why at this moment in history, this kind of mentality or sense of who we are and what we should be doing. I don't know why this is happening now, but it's happening globally. And I with rare exceptions, I think it's not declining. Now, tell me I'm wrong. Please persuade me that I'm wrong.
Well, I think that the forces have been very strong. The reaction have been very strong, as they were in the 30s in Germany, and that really working, to create counter movements is essentially important. And I think that in the past 3 years, the pro-European, pro-Remain movement has significantly grown in just through the hard work of individuals and the anger at the misrepresentation by the media.
Well, I'm sorry, in Europe, but what about in England? My impression is that I think I saw yesterday that the polls show that you're just about as evenly split as you were at the beginning. That there's some 50-50 almost.
Well, it was 50-50 at the time, and definitely there's a significant shift towards staying in Europe, and it's partly the arguments are getting out for Europe, which they weren't before, and of course we're taking on enormous power of the media, of the tabloids, the popular press, the Fox and Murdoch, and so we are having to deal with that. And I think you have to put the Trump phenomenon certainly into that context. And I think creating a counter cultural response to a dominant media that is plays to very often the lowest common denominator and to these mythologies. It's good storytelling. Unfortunately, this mythology, the nationalist mythology, which plays to some extent into Trumpism as well. It sells tickets, it sells airtime, and so on the whole, the media are really part of that. Generally, despite Trump attacking media, I know, but I think that countercultural thrust, which is outside the control of the dominant media, is really extraordinarily important. And yes, I do see it happening. It's a slow job, I don't think that you were going to defeat culturally the rise of fascism easily in the 20s and 30s, and it didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that slow work, push of countering arguments and also creating cultural innovation isn't the way to go. So I do feel much more confident now than I did a year ago.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I can't guarantee that Trump won't get back in 20, but I think that the new way, for example, the more diverse Congress gives some hopeful signs. And it's a more polarized situation, and it's certainly more polarized in Britain because, you know, I had a guy on the thruway the other day because I had my Support Europe sticker on my car. It was literally trying to run his car into me. So there's a great deal of anger out there. It's, you know, it's deeply felt in the way that, you know, obviously racial issues and gender issues, Me Too issues are felt in the US. And so this is a thing that people feel very strongly about. Now, when that took that referendum, you know, 3 years ago, people didn't feel that strongly about it. Oh, yeah, you know, it's just the price of bananas. But it wasn't, of course. It was much deeper than that. And that is now recognized. So I think we're on a much more interesting playing field, or better, we're on a much better stage now than we were 3 years ago. Because I think we're beginning to talk about the real issues. You know, and I think that may be true with the latest attack on those 4 congresswomen in the States. I think it may be that some of those real issues are coming to the fore in America finally. And surely the Republicans must look embarrassed at not calling Trump's remarks, you know, that those women going back to where they came from. I mean,
let me argue the contrary, because I mean, the reason they don't speak up against Trump is because he's going to get the votes. And he's smarter than they are. He's appealing to people who actually are going to vote for him and vote for the Republicans only if they back what he is saying. And if they do cross him, they're doing at their own peril. And that's what bothers me. I would like to think that if we lived in a world in which you can take certain retrograde ideas like nationalism and racism and fascism and really you know, obsolete and destructive notions, and have a good debate and have an argument in society, and then trounce the bad guys and send them packing, and you would never hear from them again. I thought after World War II, I thought, well, fascism is really gone now. It'll never come back. Well, here we are. And it's not like they go away forever, but there are certain, it seems to me that these really old, you know, horrible ideas take root in certain cultural in locations and persist there in maybe under the radar. Maybe they don't even speak aloud very much because it's not acceptable to use racist language, but it's still there, and it perpetuates itself, and it goes on to the next generation and so on. And I think there's really more and more of a cultural divide between uneducated rural people and urban. Now in the US and North America, we talk about it as coastal cultures. You know, the West Coast and the East Coast are different. And it's the middle of the country, and it's the rural populations that are the ones, and especially ones that are not well educated. Those are the people where you still have the perpetuation of these bad ideas, frankly, awful ideas that we thought we could eliminate by just argumentation. And I don't know how long they can survive, but they seem to have the 9 lives of a cat. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but I am, compared to you, apparently.
Well, I'm not. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but I do think that we need to look at alternative ways. I mean, for example, you're talking about defeating fascism in 1945, but because we use many of the methods, the same authoritarian and violent methods that were being used by the Nazis. You know, I mean, we don't talk about herbicide. You know, I mean, and I give some examples in my book. You know, Hamburg. You know, when we destroyed Hamburg, you know, burnt people alive by the hundreds of thousands. You know, what we were doing, we weren't killing Nazis. They were people who voted socialist. They were people who voted communist. You know, they were in the working class districts of St. Pauli. They were, but you know, so it's this indiscriminate attack on a people because they've been taken over. I'm not saying that the Germans were all, you know, very, you know, perfect citizens or whatever. But on the whole, the indiscriminate attack on another country, which is one of the reasons I've always opposed nuclear weapons.
Move your head a little bit. Nigel, move back toward the camera because I get a good view of your ear, but that's about it. Okay, that's better.
So what I'm saying is that there's a failure sometimes to look at the methods that we use and the frameworks we use and the mythologies that we carry on that are not, that in a sense are part of the problem. If we don't begin to deal with that aspect of our culture and of miseducation, I don't think we're going to get through to the farmers in Iowa, or since we have a coastal problem, the relatively deprived people in Lincolnshire or on the northeast coast of England, whose jobs and lives have been decimated by government after government. And so instead of pointing to, for example, in Britain, instead of pointing the problem being in Westminster, in the British Parliament, in the Conservative governments, and to some extent even in Tony Blair's Labour government, instead of blaming the right thing, they turn to Brussels. Why? Oh, because they're European. They don't speak English very well. This is the level at which public discourse takes place, and usually based on lies perpetrated by people like Boris Johnson, and then taken up and supported, authenticated by much of the popular media. Now, so that's a big struggle. You're facing off against, making me sound like a dyed-in-the-wool Leninist here, but a small elite of very rich people, with their fingers in all sorts of pies and money in the bank in somewhere else, and including Boris Johnson, who has his offshore accounts and all the rest of it. Rich people playing with rich media people in terms, I'm sorry, as I say, it sounds like a very primitive analysis, but you only have to look at the fact, Britain has become one of the most unequal countries in the world.
I know.
We're supposed to have a socialist petition.
But I know that, you know that. Everybody who looks at the evidence knows that.
That's right.
People who support Boris Johnson or people who support Brexit or the people who support Trump don't seem to know that. Why is it that they think they're going to bring in somebody who's going to drain the swamps, who's going to reverse the trend of the rich people owning more and more, and they think that he's on their side. He sounds like a man of the people, and therefore they think that he's going to fix their problems, their economic problems, and then he doesn't, and he only enriches his buddies, his rich guys even more, and yet, why is there this counter? Voting against their own interests. I don't understand this, that large numbers of people vote absolutely contrary to their own obvious interests and do not want to know the truth about what's going on.
There was an old German Jewish theorist who used to call it false consciousness. And which means that you can play on people's fears and their dreams in order to make them deny the realities around them.
But I think it's, I've not been much of a Marxist, and I don't think you ever were either. I failed my qualifications to be a good Marxist way long ago. Marx
wasn't a good Marxist either.
Okay. But what I don't understand now is you want to call this false consciousness, the business of voting against one's own interests.
Right.
But false consciousness implies that somebody is hoodwinking you, that you are being. But it's
themselves.
I think it's an active pursuit on their part. They are seeking to do deliberately things that are contrary to their own interests, and nobody's doing it to them. They're avidly pursuing false consciousness.
Well, I mean, I'm a humanist, and I don't have any kind of religious affiliation, but I feel that much of the history of religion is about that, isn't it? Pie in the sky when you die.
I don't know. Is that the same thing? Maybe.
If it's not Jesus, it's going to be Mussolini.
Hmm.
It's trying to find something beyond oneself, and I think we do it in the peace world too. You know, idealizing certain figures. You know, not accepting that Martin Luther King had his faults, or that Gandhi was a bit weird at times. You know,
or Aung San Suu Kyi.
Or that the United Nations was never really going to work. You know, dare I say? You know that I don't want to get rid of it, but you know, being that I think peace people are often bad at facing truths themselves, so we can hardly criticize, you know, a chicken farmer in Lincolnshire because he loves Boris Johnson, because and believing that Boris might deliver, that they find him more lovable because he's English rather than someone in Brussels who's not. You know, I mean, I think that we do live with mythologies, and I think that's a problem for peace people as well, is sort of denial sometimes, a sort of wishful thinking, and and it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I think that living with that unhappy consciousness, not false but unhappy, is can be very traumatic. And I have to tell you that, you know, when I heard the result of the vote in the referendum, I went into a profound depression, you know, clinical depression. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that anything so anti-progressive and delusional should have happened. Mm-hmm. And immediately I thought of 33, 34 in Germany. But, you know, Brexit got more than Hitler did. And I think that, recognize that we are in that this constant struggle that we've had. And I got terribly depressed with the Vietnam War too, and again, I felt that many of my brothers and sisters weren't really seeing that in a very clear way. And getting to know quite a few people, both who fought in Vietnam and people who didn't want to fight in Vietnam, but also some of the people from Vietnam itself, including a lot of refugees and some deserters and the Buddhists. And, you know, I really got to know a lot of people in those years in Vietnam. And I began to see that whole thing in a very, very different way.
I know that a couple of years ago, I was in touch with a young woman who, here in Toronto, has written 2 books about Ho Chi Minh. Very admiring of him, and she said at that time, and I expect it's still going on, that there is kind of a, well, clearly not a gang warfare, but there is malevolent relationship between, even here in Toronto, the Vietnamese who've come, who were refugees after the fall of after the end of the war, and those who supported the communist regime. And they still are in various serious kinds of conflict, apparently. I don't hear about it. It's not very public, but so I need to someday sort of unpack that and try to figure out what that's all about. It must be about the issues that were going on at the time that you were involved with those people. Yeah. Is that correct?
No, Metta, I think one of the things that I felt at the time, and it was reinforced later, was that, you know, not only in that struggle, but Iraq and many other places, and Palestine even, is that there's never just two sides. It's always much more nuanced, much more complicated than that. And I think that there were recent new series about Vietnam on PBS or something. The filmmaker who did the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement and jazz, quite a good filmmaker actually. Ken Burns. Did you see?
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm. No, I haven't seen that, but certainly Ken Burns.
What he did was he said, well, all we in the past we've only had the American side. Now we're going to have the Vietnamese, by which he meant, Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam mainly. We're going to have the Vietnamese side. But, of course, the problem was that wasn't all. If you took those who really supported the United States and those who really supported the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese leadership, they were substantial, but they were the majority. The majority were in between, which often happens in civil wars. And it was, although I'm, always felt great retrospective sympathy for the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War, one shouldn't kid oneself that everybody supported the Republic. They didn't. Not that they supported Franco, even fewer people supported Franco. But, this illusion that in a civil war you're either for them or you're against them, and it's just not true. And I think that's the problem of actually militarist and state-centric thinking, to go back to my subject, is that, that's where art comes in, where a Hemingway or an Orwell or a Martha Gellhorn or all the wonderful people who saw it as a much more nuanced picture are able to give us a much better picture of that war than any political history, and where the interviews from all sides, including fascists, it gives us a much greater sense of the tragedy of Spain, which was, which, because we didn't stand up for Spain, I really believe, and that's a pacifist speaking, because the world didn't stand up for Spain, it was inevitable we were going to get Hitler. It was inevitable we were then going to get the Cold War. The whole thing was unfolding. I mean, you can never just have a single interpretation of history. But 1936 was so critical. The democracy, the liberal, so-called liberal democracy, just didn't stand up to be counted, and they got their payback in 1940. So I do feel that we don't see this thing as nuanced enough. We don't. And basically, my book is about victims rather than dominators, and it's from the victim's point of view. And there are a lot of us. I mean, because I think to some extent we have to fight these struggles to at least be allowed to see ourselves as part of the, of suffering that dilemma, the dilemmas of social change.
Okay, now let's play with this a bit, because what you're saying is that in every big conflict, or at least the ones you've mentioned, there's a large segment that's not polarized, that they have mixed feelings, or they're in between the two sides. And I think what's happening, well, but you see, we don't say that when it comes to the current Brexit issue, or the current nationalism and the current white supremacy that's now being revealed in Trump's camp. So we don't see that. We see it as highly polarized. And in fact, in experience, I don't see it as in between at all. I see myself here in Toronto as entirely surrounded by people who think the way I do. You notice that you and I are talking. I'm not calling some fascist to interview them. I'm calling somebody I like, somebody I agree with. And if you ask me how many people I know who actually support Trump, I've only met one person who overtly said so in my whole life. I've only personally had a conversation with one person. That means that I'm not reaching out, or I'm not in social connection with those people who have some intermediate goals. It's not only do I not know the opposite side, because they certainly are at the opposite side, but that I've never even met anybody who's in between. I don't know that there's anybody who's halfway Trumpish. Tell me.
I mean, if you talk about that situation, I know what you mean, but I do think that the first thing is that we tend to talk to ourselves. I think people in the peace community generally tend to, even if we've got some small differences, we tend to talk to ourselves. And that's, part of the problem, I think, why we were not getting out there and finding a way to communicate. And that's where I think things like popular music and theater and movies sometimes can get through, where, if I go into a pub locally to find someone who supports Brexit and start to get in the conversation, the danger is that it's going to become very, very antagonistic, very aggressive. Mm-hmm. And if I find someone who actually is in between and they're just there because they really haven't thought about it very much, then it may become embarrassing for them, because I may correct them on for, the cost of the National Health Service or whatever being in Europe, whatever it is. But if I do that, then that will be seen as pulling my educated weight against their lack of knowledge, and so it's a very difficult discourse. And I think where the place you can go is not just to take that argument head on, but start. For example, I was talking to someone a couple of days ago, I think probably was supported Brexit, and I said, he said, I just can't get anybody, to work for me anymore to do these jobs. And I said, I bet, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I bet there are some Polish lads who would do it. He said, oh yes. He said, yeah, we do. he said, we've got a couple over there and they're doing wonderful work, and they come in and they don't, they get on with it and they're great. And but so in that context, he was able to, basically say what I would say is, look, let's do it all together and don't start being anti-Polish or whatever it is. And so I think if we can find those keys to a more broad-based dialogue, then maybe we will actually start talking to some of those Trump supporters. Because I do know a few people who have supported Brexit, and it's a very difficult conversation to have. And people lose friendships, over it. It's not worth it. I mean, I don't think that's helpful. I think, and so I think there's a great challenge for peace movement, really, peace work generally, to try and move outside the bubble. And it's always been a problem. I remember when people used to throw things at the Oakland cops, and I didn't like the Oakland cops very much. But I think, come on, this is a working class guy, and you're just going to make the problem worse if you start, like Bobby Avakian, throwing Molotov cocktails at, come on, the son of a judge, it's crazy.
Okay, let's talk about what to do about this, because, on the one hand, I admire my friend. Do you remember Arlie Hochschild? Because we were in the same cohort in Berkeley.
Yes.
Arlie has remained a very dear friend of mine. We don't talk all that much anymore.
I saw Adam recently. I saw Adam.
Yes, Adam too is a very dear one, a close friend. But again, we don't exactly inhabit the same circuits lately. But in any case, Arlie has been doing this wonderful work of going right to the heart of red states, or to right now she's not only did she do this thing in Louisiana where she tried to find out why the Louisianans do exactly the thing that I'm puzzled by. Why do they do things that are so harmful to their own interests? They vote just absolutely against their own economic or even environmental and health interests and educational interests and so on. So she wrote this wonderful book, Strangers on Their Own Land, and now she's going to, I can't think of whether it's North Carolina or Appalachia or someplace where it's the town where the leading white supremacist, I think he was somebody who actually organized this Charlottesville Nazi march or something of that kind. I'm talking about something I really don't know enough about, but she's going and talking to these people, living with them, trying to understand them and so on. And then she tries to be an interpreter between our cultures.
Right.
But I must say, I still don't get it. I don't fully, I don't know whether she really gets it, to be honest. I don't really know whether she can explain how people can be so oblivious to their own well-being as to know that out in the backyard there's this chemical dump that people are polluting, and they've killed every member of my family with cancer, and yet they will vote to try to abolish the EPA or something, and prevent anything from cleaning it up. I come away from her book still wondering. It's still a bit of a mystery to me. So I think what I'm saying is that your work or your proposal, if I'm hearing you right, that we need to explore each other's cultures a little bit better and underpinning assumptions a little better than we've been doing. That sounds like a very good thing. I'm not sure how to solve the problem. Is that really the most appropriate or the most effective way of overcoming what I think both of you and I agree uh, uh, are the problems, problematic attitudes and beliefs that we have to defeat, frankly defeat.
Yeah. So what alternatives, Metta, have you got? What alternatives do you
Well, you're talking culture. I tend to talk structure. I tend to think more in terms of creating additional rules that enable more transnational dialogue. For example, right now, this very show that we're making at the moment is going to be subjected to Facebook's censorship program, a new system that they've had to adopt because of pressure in the US Congress against what went on with the Russian trolls and so on. They weren't cautious enough, and so now they are overreacting and saying, according to their official position now, you can only talk about on Facebook, you can only advertise dialogues or conversations about social issues or political issues within your own country. In other words, if this conversation, theoretically, because I'm having this conversation about a social problem or social issue, I should only be allowed to show it to other Canadians, not to anybody in Britain, certainly not to anybody in the US, etc. Now, that is exactly the worst kind of policy, and it is a structural rule that if followed will have extremely deleterious consequences, but I can't get anybody else exercised about it. My journalist friends, when I began to be affected by it and overruled by the staff of Facebook and told, no, you can't publish this, I wrote an anguished protest letter to their journalists, famous ones, and asked for help. And they didn't react. It's as if people now are more concerned about protecting, certainly the integrity of the elections that are forthcoming. We do not want Russians interfering with the elections. I understand that. But they're much more worried about that than they are about the very harmful, I think, nationalistic effect of only having discourse about social issues limited to your own society.
Well, that's crazy. Yeah, I didn't know about that. No.
I can't get anybody to help me fight them.
Certainly concern us is the question of a state using propaganda across boundaries. I think that's reasonable. But again, you have to be very careful, I think, because, it may militate against very important information that we should be part of common discourse. So again, I'm very, very, I think it's good. You must know that I have structural concerns. Of course, I want to change structures, but how do you do that? And my sense is, first of all, you have to kind of get a framework of understanding that will then lead to action, and that will build those, in that process, build those alternative structures, or at least reinforce those that are worth keeping, which is, which is why, in structural terms, I want to see part of British sovereignty remain within the European Union and not go floating off to some little Singapore that's searching for markets anywhere, and which is horrible. I mean, and is no form of progress. I disagree with some of because there are socialist critics of Europe who are quite happy about Brexit, but they don't have any clear alternative. I say, well, sort of, okay, so you're going to fight the struggle where? With Putin, with Trump. Where is this arena of contest going to be? At least, we built something in Europe. It's far from perfect, but it's the best we've got. And, the potential for cultural and political and structural progress there is enormous. Mm. And the city rules from Facebook, like the ones you've described, I think, and so that's, I think you have to choose where you could possibly make a difference. And so that's where I would go. But I do think that I'm not just about culture, separated out from structural issues, because I think they're really locked together.
Okay, how do you proceed in terms of your own policies of political action? What do you think is the most promising avenue for us, let's say the two of us, if we are on the same team, to use in this struggle, if you will?
Well, I think it's more of the same, really. I mean, for me, it's trying to move on the process of demystification, demythologizing individual structures, policies, talking up the kind of things you just talked about, the ridiculous policy of interfering with information transformation across national boundaries. That's ridiculous. I mean, we know in our gut that that's rubbish. So I think that every day, every time you see a TV program that has false assumptions, false mythologies, or a newspaper, work with others, to try and position an alternative voice somewhere there. If it's not yours, someone else's. So we've got some really good people in England. I mean, you remember Mary Caldor, for example.
Oh yes, I love Mary. I've been trying to reach her. I want to interview her again one of these days.
Because I mean, she constantly says the right thing. It's very sharp on these kinds of issues. By all means, using the new media to put out good voices, good arguments, good articles, good images, and promoting good books.
Well, I'm working, you might say a structural, or maybe you will call it a cultural thing. I'm developing this website for to save the world. And it is an attempt to bring people together transnationally, working on the same issues without regard to where we live. And so I hope you'll have a look at it. So we need to wind this up. We've gone over time, but a lot of it's going to have to, some of it's going to have to be removed anyway.
Remove my ear.
Oh, your ear is the star of the show.
Thanks, Metta.
Okay, it's been great fun, and I hope we'll be back in touch. And
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.